From the heartland of America, it's the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf. Executive producer, David Stuckman.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past, 39 years. So, in the movie All the President's Men, the informant, Deep Throat, tells Bob Woodward to follow the money. Just follow the money and the whole plot will unravel. And following the money has become a law enforcement mantra for unraveling complex criminal investigations. And we talked to Jen Coffendorfer several episodes ago, and she's a retired FBI agent who worked on major international drug cases, and the technique was the same. Follow the money. Find out where the money goes, and you find the head of the snake. Law enforcement often marks currency with the idea that if they seize that currency in the possession of a third party, then that third party can be tied back to the underlying crime. But following the money can be difficult. In another movie, Godfather 2, Willie Chichi, a mafia hitman, is testifying before Congress, and he was asked if there was always, quote, a go-between or a buffer between him and the bosses giving the orders. And Chichi laughs and responds, yeah, buffer. The family had a lot of buffers. And then bringing this back home in the world of non-governmental organizations or NGOs that are involved in the repeated attacks on bail, there are also a lot of buffers. And these buffers are a lot more sophisticated than a couple guys in the parking lot saying, yeah, that guy we were talking about? No, not him, the other guy from Jersey. We don't need to see him no more. But it's not like that. Instead, these NGOs have literally tens of millions of dollars and enough connections that a conspiracy theorist would run out of string for his picture wall. Now, I attended a conference a few months ago where my guest today was attempting to kind of unravel all this and explain. And I knew we had to have him on to help confuse us more about whether or not the so-called bail reform is an organic movement that just cropped up to address a glaring problem in the criminal justice system, or if bail reform is just the tip of the iceberg of an organized attempt to tear down the criminal justice system as we know it. But before I go too far down the rabbit hole and then pull out the yarn myself and the tinfoil hat, let me introduce my guest. Eric Granof is the Vice President of Corporate Communications for AIA Surety and is now a two-time guest on the podcast. And in fact, he was the guest for the very first video episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast. And we're happy that we didn't scare him away after that first time. So Eric, welcome back.
It's great to be here, Shane. Thanks for having me back.
Well, thank you for being here. So I know in the first episode, we kind of covered your CV, but maybe you just give a little bit of background, give us your call to authority, why we should listen to you. What's your experience here?
Well, I mean, my original background comes from marketing communications, and I worked kind of ancillary to the business for several years. And then about 17, 18 years ago now, came in to work for AIA Surety as in charge of their kind of communications internally and externally, and got involved in kind of the government relations stuff as well. And really where I started kind of looking into the issues surrounding our business, looking into the bail reform movement, looking into legislative issues and where these legislative fights kind of are originating from and where they're going and historically what's happened. And it really is it seems to be kind of this never-ending story or this never-ending battle that we have that continuously evolves, yet after enough time kind of goes back to the original place where you started with the same arguments that you fought 15 years ago. But on the bright side of things, we have a good argument where it's based in fact, it's based in experience, it's based in a historical record of what we do. And I think that's why we have the longevity that we have, because what we do in our industry, it works. and it's been proven.
You're stealing my closing from me there, but
Oh, sorry. That's right.
anyway, I think it is fair to say that you do some deep dives into these issues surrounding bail. When we had you on here last time, you talked about an estimation, because it's really hard to pin down an estimation of the actual cost in aggregate and trying to put a dollar total on that to society as a result of these more lenient release policies and the resultant increases in crime. And as in the last podcast, basically that number could be measured in terms of percentages of GDP. So it's not a small number. But now you've done another deep dive into the funding of bail reform. And as I recall, this book here, for people watching on video, Rogue Prosecutors by Zach Smith and Cully Stimson, was a really good source. Can you kind of give us the broad, maybe the Cliff Notes version of your presentation?
Yeah. I really kind of, not taking too much time, I'll really try to give the elevator speech here, but if you look back at the history of the bail reform movement, and it really has its origins in kind of the government entities being funded by tax dollars that would then try to operate within the criminal justice system as a release mechanism that would, I think originally intended, complement the private side of the business, being what we do in terms of surety bail. For people who couldn't afford a bond, for people who had special circumstances or special needs, that these entities would exist and they'd be funded by the government to help those who couldn't help themselves. And I think, historically, we're fine with that because no one should not have the services they need. That being said, these groups, like I said, that have been funded by tax dollars have kind of grown in size, and they've grown in terms of their reach, because what they realize is it's super hard to justify an existence with such a small population, because the reality is that population is pretty small, and without additional resources to back up what their goal is, was just to help these people help themselves. So programs like drug and alcohol or mental health programs that should be part of these pretrial programs, they never get funded, really. So you have this funding of the pretrial, and it never really goes beyond that. And you're seeing that in California right now, where you have a governor that won't fund Prop 36, which is to specifically help with these mental health and alcohol and substance abuse programs. So what's happened over time is that, at least in the years that I've been here and the years that I've talked to other people that were here prior to me, is that the way these fights always kind of ended up was when the other side ran out of money, because tax dollars aren't endless like they are today. Back in the day, they never used to be. So you'd have a budget, you'd run out of money, and then you couldn't really compete in terms of promoting your services within the court, and bail would always end up working. And one of the outcomes of what would happen with these groups is that because they didn't have the budgets, because they didn't have the track record we did, they had to kind of mess with the numbers a little bit. So you'd see them calculating their failure to appears differently. You'd see them not updating their risk assessment tools and things like that needed to happen for what they were doing to be effective and to be legit. And over time, what we've seen happen is, as the tax dollars dried up, we've suddenly seen about 8 years ago this shift in private money that has gone into these pretrial programs. And I'm saying pretrial programs really overall for the bail reform movement, we'll say, okay, because that's really the genesis of it. And what we've seen is bail reform movement grow now because of these private dollars that are going into it. And what we've seen these private dollars also do as kind of part of this bail reform movement is go into political campaigns for district attorneys, for prosecutors, that we had never seen before. And what I uncovered in a lot of this research, and what's in this book as well, is the strategy that was uncovered behind the scenes to fund these types of local elections that are very easy to win because it requires very little money. Some of these prosecutors get elected with like $500, and they would go into these more rural areas. They'd go into these areas where you had, prosecutors that couldn't really beat someone in an election, and they'd win. And these people that would win would have their marching orders from the people that funded them to do certain things. So what we've seen is a lot of this private money has moved into the bail reform fight, but have done it in a way that they've in a sense bought one of the really key chess pieces that is going to do their bidding. And that's what we've seen. We've seen prosecutors decide, I'm not going to file these charges anymore. I'm not going to require cash bail anymore. I'm going to go do this. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to follow the rules because I'm going to use my prosecutorial discretion. And that's a big key word here, is because what it is these prosecutors can do whatever they want. And it really shows the power and strength of this chess piece that they seem to have bought.
Well, and we talked to a couple other people about that as well. I know we had Kim Ogg on, several, maybe a year ago, right at the end of her campaign or primary that she lost, and she was originally the beneficiary of funds from these groups. And then when she didn't fall in line and backed off the program, suddenly that money all got ripped away, and her primary competitor had all this money to come along. Now we see that happen a lot in political parties, where, okay, well, if you don't vote the way the party votes or the way the party wants to, suddenly you're going to be facing a primary candidate. That's something we sort of expect in a political party. We don't really expect some private actor to come out and go, well, I'm going to fund you, because we think about how much money is in politics. Well, there's this limitation. Well, we can only donate $2,000 or $1,000 to this campaign. Well, how does some group like this or these groups, and we'll get into what some of these groups are or who they are, but how do they somehow then throw in $1 million into a district attorney's office campaign? And one, that money gets dispersed to a variety of different groups who can then individually, they're pass-through entities. I'll give, $100,000 out here, and each of these 100 different NGOs will donate $1,000 to your game. And that's one way to do it. The other way is simply PACs, political action committees. And they're just diabolical, these political action committees, like Sheriffs for Justice. It's like, oh, that sounds awesome, but it's an anti-law enforcement group. And so they will then turn around and send out $10,000, $20,000 worth of mailers to an election area saying, oh, you need to not vote for this person because of whatever. They can't advocate for a specific candidate, but they can certainly go negative to tear down the other candidate. So, how do these groups basically throw that sort of, is that the only way, or are there other ways that they throw that kind of money into those campaigns?
Well, see, there's a concept, and I talk about it in the presentation, called smurfing. Okay. And what smurfing is, and it's not a dance, but in a way, it is a kind of a dance, because you're dancing around the rule of law in a sense. But so if I were to say, I want to build a bomb, and I go out and I buy all the ingredients for a bomb, I'm going to show up on 50,000 different, warning things, and I'm going to be in trouble, right?
Exactly.
But if I say there's like 100 ingredients it takes to build a bomb, if I send out 100 people to different locations all over the country, and I tell them each to get one ingredient, it's probably not going to come across the radar of some of these law enforcement groups. And so what they're done with their kind of political donations, and it's interesting when you talk about something being a political donation at the prosecutor level, because prosecutor is supposed to be an objective third party, an objective person that has the law that they use as their touchstone, right? And so everything is based against that. So it's not necessarily any kind of political influence, but however, there's a very large amount of political influence that's now going into these elections. And the money is coming from, it's exactly like the bomb example. They're smurfing these campaigns where they basically, they create and fund 100 groups, and all 100 groups give the amount that they want. And these people have an extraordinary amount of money. But if you follow the money back, it comes from the same source. And that's one of the things we did in the presentation, was we tried to follow the money. And I know Stimson in Rogue Prosecutors follows the money as well. And you can begin to see that it's a very small group of very wealthy people that are funding a very large range of these social justice criminal justice, bail reform types of organizations. And while you get the appearance or the perception that they're separate entities that are just agreeing on a topic, you look behind the scenes, you find it's the same group of people all working together to create the appearance of a large majority believe this, when the reality is it's a very small majority pulling the puppet strings.
Well, and I know in anticipation of this, I went through and was looking at these different groups, and you can there's websites, Influence Watch and stuff like that, where they kind of track this stuff, and it's just wild. The same names keep cropping up. Well, this person is this, and they donate to here, and then that person turns around and donates back to here. I mean, it's just a shell game of moving all this money around, and then the money gets spit out to various places. I would think some of that, though, there's a concern about, a lot of that is like government money that comes in. I know that just a couple months ago, there was a big announcement that the Justice Department had canceled 350 grants totaling $810 million to various groups. And, you had to kind of search because, the left wing went crazy about that, but, to try and figure out what those were. But there were, the Brennan Center got, money taken away. The Vera Institute of Justice got money taken away. The Pretrial Justice Institute got money taken away. And I think Vera lost like $4 million worth of grants, and Pretrial Justice Institute lost at least $1 million, if not more than that. But so you get these basically, these government entities give these grants, and, this is the same thing that's been used in abortion politics, is money is fungible. And so if you grant them money and then, well, it's for this purpose over here, and this political campaign that I'm making over here, well, that's not the same pile of money. It's like, well, yes, it is the same pile of money, because if I wasn't spending money on this, I would be spending money here. It was the same, if you fund Planned Parenthood, and I know abortion's a third rail topic. I'm just using that as a comparative example. The federal government gives money to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood then turns around and gives money back to political candidates to support them giving more money. It just still does seem like, you're laundering money back into the political process for that degree of influence.
Yeah, and I mean, I go back to, when I grew up, you'd watch television and you'd see these commercials about, starving children in Africa, or, not having water, and making donations to provide food for the people that are starving, or making donations that would get clean water to the people that don't have water. And what you see, you don't see that nowadays anymore. What you see is, these billionaires, instead of giving money to help real problems, they're giving money to political groups and political initiatives that are kind of changing the whole system, which seems too big. Like, you shouldn't have that much power with money. I mean, if you want to use your money for good, go tackle that problem directly. Don't try to do it through the system. And it just seems like what this money has done is it's changed the way our politics are working, and it changes the way that policy is created now. And it's not done necessarily because it's the best thing for the people. It's done because someone has a, some motive to do something. And I think that, especially in our world, we've seen a lot of this. It's like, why are these billionaires giving money to these groups that, in essence, just want to, release people for free, do not hold them accountable for crimes they commit? I mean, that's what this soft on crime push that's been put in there. It's being, purposefully perpetuated by people with more money than anybody. And it's being done in the name of helping these groups, when in reality, there's no soft on crime. There is no bail reform policy that has ever helped a community that it has claimed to be helping. In fact, it makes it worse, because what it does is, when you let people out of jail with no accountability, they're not going into the rich person's neighborhood. They're going back into the communities that are trying to be protected from them, and they're committing more crimes. And so what ends up happening, and then those people lose essential services because CVS doesn't want to operate in those neighborhoods. So all these wealthy people that are trying to, for whatever reason, be more fair to people or do this because it's supposed to help people. It's having the complete opposite effect, and then at some point it's turned sinister along the way, at least in my opinion, where you now have these groups that are being funded by billionaires that I don't think sometimes even understand what these groups are really about. And they're doing things to our system that aren't good, that aren't what's in the best interest of the communities. It's not what people are voting for. It's not what people truly want, to live their lives like. So it's pretty scary. I mean, like, as I was doing all this research, you talk about going down the rabbit hole. I'm still waiting to come out of the rabbit hole. I feel like where's my little bottle to make me grow back to regular size or whatever I need? But it really opens your eyes to, you'd like to see that the system is supposed to work in a certain way, and you see this manipulation, and it's kind of depressing in a way that it is being manipulated in this way. But once again, I feel like you get the right arguments, you have the right facts, you can still win these fights. But it's getting harder because the enemies are throwing more at it.
Well, let's maybe try and as best we can without graphic involvement, maybe name some names and stretch the threads between some of this stuff. I mean, obviously, I think we anybody that follows anything right wing news will immediately jump to George Soros and the Open Society Foundation, and because the Soros Foundation Open Society donates a great deal of money to a large number of what can only be described as left wing causes. But where does that money sort of go, and how does that get moved around? I know that they referenced in the book several different places, the Tide Center being a big one, and they don't just reference George Soros. They also reference Dustin Moskowitz, I think is the name, one of the co-founders of Facebook, that he and his wife are active in another large group that's similar and sort of I don't know, directly associated, but sort of side by side to Open Society. What are some of these groups that we might have heard? I know I mentioned some of the other ones like Vera and Brennan, but what are some of these groups and how do they operate?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of these groups, they get money. Like you've mentioned a few of them. There's one called Democracy Alliance, which is a group of very, very wealthy people. It's super secretive. Like, it's really hard to get the names of the people that donate, but they give a specific amount of money to a group of specific groups that, and if I went on and I looked at some of their websites, and they all have some kind of bail reform component to it. Even though it's not necessarily what the group sounds like it does, there's a bill like, end mass incarceration, end cash bail. It's all the same messaging across these groups. You mentioned the Tide Center. That's kind of their incubator where smaller groups can get funding from the Tide Center. There's a group called Arabella, which I actually just saw them on the news the other day, that they're out there in terms of, they bring together, I describe them as, if Soros is Darth Vader, then if Soros is the Dark Lord, then Arabella is like Darth Vader. It's like carrying out all these things. And they put money into these funds, they call them, which is kind of where this money sits. And then these funds give money back and forth to each other. They give money to these other organizations. And this network that they've created, it's pretty unbelievable. And it's an all-encompassing closed system that they've created of the money and the funding that funds the research, that funds the PR team that takes the research and puts the message out there, that funds the activist groups that then take the research and distribute it to the media, distribute it to legislators. They fund the fact-checking groups that take a look at the research that then say, this is true. They fund the media outlets. They fund journalist schools. So they're creating this closed system that is spitting out data that is seen as fact because they control every aspect of the creation of that fact. And then they cite resources between groups. You have a group like the Data Collaborative for Justice that is citing statistics from a study that another sister group of theirs did that's then being quoted by a legislator in the creation of a piece of legislation to get away with, to do away with cash bail that really has no facts in it other than the fact that it's just somebody said something, somebody agreed with them, so we're going to write a paper on it and now use that paper to pass a piece of legislation. It's really kind of scary to think that this one group, this cabal, or whatever you want to call it, has enough money to create an entire system of information creation that is just false. That is, perpetuating one belief system that they want everyone to have. I mean, because you can look at data about bail. We know exactly what our statistics are. We know exactly who we get back to court and who we don't, because if we don't, we go out of business.
Right.
The math doesn't work. You get 90% of the people that you bail out when you're collecting a 10% premium, you go out of business. You have to get 99.9% people back. And it's just, we wouldn't exist if it didn't work. Yet the lies and the data that's being spun out of these systems of these constellations that I referred to in the presentation, it's scary. I mean, it really is scary in the size and the scope of this stuff.
Well, I know you mentioned the Tide Center as an incubator, but and just to tie them directly into bail, I know that they are. Some stuff I read is that the Tide Center maintains the list for the National Bail Fund Network, which is a network of charitable bail funds that goes out and supposedly bonds people out for free. I've always sort of wondered, and I don't know if the numbers have ever been publicly released, after George Floyd, these bail funds got collectively, between the Bail Project and the Minnesota Freedom Fund, I think they collected $80 million. That's a lot of money for individuals to be sitting there. How many individuals have to throw out $20 to get up to $80 million? And were there really, 4 million, or I guess what would the math on 400,000 people that have to throw in, $20 to reach that? Maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but how much of that could have come from more of these sources?
I think you had influencers play a role in that, right? I mean, you get, a pop star that has 3 million followers that says, "Oh, I just gave money to the bail fund." And next thing you know, that happens. You get a vice president candidate that gets out there and says, "Oh, give money to the bail fund," without knowing anything about what the bail fund does. It was a knee-jerk reaction. I can see how you can raise a lot of money. I know people that gave because the way it was positioned was something that made, I think, the average person say, "Oh, wow, that's horrible. I should give some money to this." And, it's the troubling thing about this is that no one knows where the money went, because it wasn't used to bail people out.
Right.
And then when you watch interviews with the people like the Minnesota Freedom Fund, when it was the president of the Minnesota Freedom Fund getting up there and saying, we don't even look at the charges. This is about F the police. This is about F the system. I mean, that interview, I'll never forget that interview, because here's a guy that is literally just bailing people out, regardless of how dangerous they are, because he doesn't think that he thinks the system is racist or whatever issue he has with the system. And meanwhile, you get situations where you have a parent. The beauty of what we do is that we involve the family. And that's always been our kind of discussion point, right? But that goes deeper than just the financial guarantee of what we do. There's a family component of the family having the right to know what's going on with their loved one. And when you have a family that wants maybe someone to stay in jail for a few days to dry out, maybe get off the drugs, and then you have a bail fund that comes in and bails someone out. Next thing you know, that person goes out and either kills themselves or kills somebody else because they're drinking and driving or doing drugs. That kind of stuff, that's irresponsible. To do that in isolation of any other information other than, I don't think people should be sitting in jail. And I think that gets overlooked with these bail funds. But I think now people's eyes are opening up to how dangerous this is and the irresponsibility of it.
Well, I did see that the Minnesota Freedom Fund, and side note is that their current president, I think, was convicted as a juvenile of murder. And so is now then, that's the person that you have, and I don't think, again, I don't want to get into too terrible, but I know that the statement was he was convicted as a juvenile of murder. And so then spent some time in prison and got out. And then suddenly he's now an advocate for, the horrors of the criminal justice system. It's like, well, I don't know that you were killing someone.
You know what that sounds like to me? Here's someone that got in trouble as a youth, that went into the system, that did their time, and now they're out there fighting for justice. That sounds to me like the system worked. What if he didn't get arrested? Would he be dead? Would he be on drugs right now? Where would that person... Listen, it's a horrible thing that you have to go into the system, but here's someone that came out of the system better and ready to fight. To me, that sounds like the system worked.
Sure, but a lot of this comes out of, and they talk about this in this Rogue Prosecutors book, comes out of what's referred to as the prison abolition movement. Arguments about mass incarceration and that, that we shouldn't have prisons at all. And because the United States, imprisons so many people per capita compared to other countries, that it's just a method of oppression against unfavored groups. And so the unfavored groups are obviously, in the United States, our only unfavored groups are people of minority races. Because we don't have, religious ethnic breakdowns along the lines of, Shia versus Sunni Muslim. And so all the Shias are in prison in one country and all the Sunnis are in prison in another country. The prison system in the United States is not used like it is elsewhere around the world. But then you argue and go, look, only 5% of people that commit crimes actually end up in prison for those crimes. So do we really have a mass incarceration problem or an under incarceration problem?
Yep.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it's like, when's the last time you've seen new jails being built, right? And look at our population, how it's grown over the last few years. I see mini malls being built all the time. I see Targets and Walmarts being built all the time to handle the uptick in population growth we have. But you never see, you have the same amount of prison space for a growing population. And unfortunately, there's going to be bad people in the world, and you need to have places to do things to do with those people. I mean, there's some countries, we complain about our system. There's some countries you get caught stealing. What do? They cut your hands off. I mean, there's worse punishments out there. So I mean, when they criticize our system, and it's not perfect, but I think it still does a pretty good job. But if you can't expand your system to keep up with the growth population like you can every other service, I mean that's where you're going to run into problems.
Well, just as an aside on that, this is probably 25 years ago, but there was a guy that one of my competitors here had on bond for some sort of fugitive case. It was a sex crime related deal. And he showed up in court and got that addressed, and he was deported after that to Saudi Arabia, where he was originally from. And based on that conviction here, we heard back from that once he was deported to Saudi Arabia, they took him off the plane and killed him. I don't know. It was not a very long time between, oh, hey, United States convicts you of this sex crime, you're not coming here. And they actually executed him for that, not for a crime committed in their country, but because he'd committed that crime before. So, this whole, they're not cutting people's hands off anymore. Well, they're doing something in some of these other places. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go into caning or executing people or anything like that for deterrence, but so this prison abolition movement, one of the people that's referenced in the book as being a critical actor in all of these is a woman named Chloe Cockburn. It's spelled Cockburn, but it's pronounced Coburn. Now, long time ago, when I used to actually listen to NPR, I first heard the term limousine liberal. And there are a couple other versions of that, that have kind of cute alliteration, champagne socialist and Mercedes Marxist. But basically, it's a pejorative, from the late 60s in New York politics. There was a candidate for New York mayor who described limousine liberals were, and this is quoting, hypocritical, wealthy do-gooders insulated from the negative fallout of their bad ideas. Now, we've seen that echo over the years. Al Sharpton, who we generally don't see as a defender of the police, actually used the term latte liberal and criticized what he referred to as mostly white and high-income left-leaning people that were sitting around the Hamptons who advocated for defund the police movement and ignored the concerns of African Americans that suffer under high crime rates. And those communities need a stronger police presence. But the bail reform movement and any of these NGOs, they need someone like Coburn. And she describes herself, I think accurately, as a social elite. She's an elite white woman in her own words. So what am I doing working on things that counter mass incarceration? But she can move through those circles of the super wealthy. I mean, she basically admits her grandfather was an admitted communist, card-carrying communist. Her father was an editor at Harper's. She's a Harvard Law graduate. I mean, she's smart. Her sister is a beautiful, famous actress, Olivia Wilde. So I can't go into a cocktail party and go, you know what? This pro-bail group, they really need your Facebook money to help support this. But she can. People like her can. They can go to the cocktail parties. They can go to the donation circuits for the ultra wealthy and convince them to assuage their perceived guilt by giving money for these things. Can you tell us maybe a little bit more about her? I mean, if you remember in the details on her in the book.
Yeah, I know her name pops up a lot in terms of her involvement with a lot of these groups, specifically within the groups that were getting these rogue prosecutors elected. She's connected. I think it's called Fair and Just Prosecutors. It's a group that is funded by a group called Just Impact, and she's involved with Just Impact. And so, and she played a role in terms of the Soros connection as well, just because there's a woman named Whitney Tynes also at the beginning of all this that worked with Chloe Coburn in terms of coming up with kind of the prosecutor strategy, which initially didn't start with bail reform. It started with the death penalty.
Right.
And they focused on two states that, had, very robust death penalties that once they started and got prosecutors elected who were anti-death penalty, even though the states allowed for the death penalty, they basically stopped because of prosecutorial discretion. So they figured out the power of that prosecutor component, and they got money from Soros initially to fund it, and then they went off and just blew it out. And I mean, I think in the presentation, I think there's been about 170 different prosecutors, these rogue prosecutors that have been over time put into office, and then they, eventually their policies fail and they get kicked out. It seems to be the trend, but even now you get new guys that are still getting elected. Krasner, he's still going in Philadelphia, and he's one of the kind of their top guys, their golden boy. There's common sense prevail when you look at California. Got rid of Chesed Boudin and Gascon in LA because they saw what was happening in those communities with the crime. So
talk about prosecutorial discretion just a little bit on that, because I don't think it means what these groups are saying it means. I mean, if it means what these groups are saying, if prosecutorial discretion means I can just refuse to charge an entire class of crime that the legislature has adopted, is that not what we would refer to as the prosecutor's veto? I mean, are you not then usurping the power of the legislative and judicial branches in our triumvirate system of government if the prosecutor just says, no, I don't like that? I mean, they're not doing it because, sometimes, same-sex sodomy laws have been used to attack gay marriage and homosexual relationships. And there are still some of those on the books, but no one prosecutes those because they're unconstitutional at this point. There's a far difference between I'm not going to enforce an unconstitutional law that probably shouldn't be on the books and hasn't been enforced in 50 years versus I'm not going to enforce theft under $1,000. There's a wide disparity between those two things. So in your understanding, I mean, I realize you're not a prosecutor, but what is prosecutorial discretion supposed to mean?
Well, I think it's deciding kind of the severity of a sentence potentially, or maybe what level of crime you are going to go after. I mean, we just saw this, in Idaho yesterday. The big news with, the Kohlberger case is that they did a plea deal, and I think there was a lot of people outraged about that. But the prosecutor used prosecutorial discretion to come up with a deal that he felt was fair. And I agree with you. I think that's completely different, using that discretion to navigate within the system and within charges or within a case, as opposed to just flat out saying the day that you put your hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the laws of a state and the Constitution of that state, the next breath saying there's these 13 laws, I'm not going to charge anymore, or I'm not going to ask for cash bail anymore, or to me, that's rewriting the books. And I don't think that's the role of a prosecutor. Their job is to uphold the law and protect the community, not protect the people that are committing the crimes. And I think that's the shift that's happened, is that the concept of victimhood is completely left the actual victim. It is now on the poor person that has committed the crime, and every excuse we want to give them for why they committed the crime. The old joke about, they're stealing just because they want to feed their family, right?
Yeah.
It's like you're walking out of a Walmart with a big screen TV in your hands. They sell bread, they sell food. Why aren't you stealing food for your family if you're trying? So it just, we got to stop giving excuses to these people. And I feel like that's what's being used, is that, just forgiving these crimes because of a certain class of people, or because it really just makes no sense. And I agree with you. It's not prosecutor discretion in the way it was meant to be.
Well, I have a theory on that, and it kind of goes back to our wealthy do-gooders. Is Victor Hugo, I believe I got the right author, wrote Les Miserables. And I know I read it in high school in a French class, so I don't know that it completely transferred over. But the character of Jean Valjean is the character that gets caught stealing bread to feed his family. And it turns out he really is, trying to feed his family. It's a heart of gold sort of thing. But I mean, how long has Les Mis been on Broadway? I mean, it's been 50 years that it's been continuously run. Who goes to see Les Mis? We're talking the ultra wealthy, the rich, these same sorts of people that make these sort of donations. Not only are they donating to support the theater that's playing Les Mis, they're like, oh, look, these criminals are just like Jean Valjean. And so it's got to be a corrupt system, because that's the way it was here. And that's the only experience they actually have with criminal activity. The old notion that, a Republican is just a Democrat who's been mugged. Those people never get exposed to the actual, this is what happens in criminal offenses.
Yeah.
So, and so they're more inclined to donate to these things. So let me I know that you have a short time today, so we'll try and speed through this a little bit more than we might normally do. In the book, Road Prosecutors, there were 8 prosecutors that were highlighted. So each prosecutor had his own chapter, and they were considered the poster children for how this went. I mean, they referred to George Gascon as the worst of the worst. But we also had Kim Fox in Chicago, Kim Gardner in St. Louis, Rachel Rollins in Boston, Chesa Bodine in San Francisco, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, and finally Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and Alvin Bragg in New York. Now, you talked about, they get into office, they do all these things, and then they leave. How many of those people are left?
Right now, I think there's still about 70 something that I think are still in office.
Right.
And I think that, this last go around with elections, I think there was 13 that won and 12 that lost that were Soros prosecutors. But, all these guys, they kind of get the same package, right? It's like they find somebody who agrees with them ideologically, that agrees that they're going to go down this path, and they dump a bunch of money into their election. They give them the resources they need, which is a very important part of this. They get PR help. They get activist group help. They get feet on the ground of people that are going to knock on doors. That's all provided to them as part of this kind of package, this rope prosecutor package. And it's all under the promise of that when you get elected, that you're going to carry out these types of initiatives, that you're going to issue on the first day a list of crimes that you're not going to prosecute, that you're going to try to encash bail, that you're going to do all these things as part of your agreement, and we'll continue to support you. We'll continue to give you social media posts. We'll continue to give you PR help. We're going to continue to do all these things for you as long as you play ball. And you mentioned Kim Ogg earlier. Kim Ogg, she was all bought in. She was a big force in Harris County behind their bail reform movement that was involved in that whole federal lawsuit. And what ended up happening was she saw the facts. She saw the reports that saw that crime increased, violent crime increased, the amount of time between recidivism increased. Every important metric went up. And she said, well, hold on a second here. This isn't working. And it's exactly what you said. What happened? Come Sean Tier. And Sean Tier wins the primary by 50 points. Because they destroyed their princess, who was the person they supported for 8 years or 6 years, and then she disagreed with them, and you throw a new guy in that's going to play ball with you. And the amount of interactions, there's a couple of things like Chesed Boudin in San Francisco had a ridiculous amount of email interactions in meetings with these guys, this fair and just prosecutors group. It was almost like one communication a day. I think it's I think it's Jose Gonzalez in Texas, another prosecutor. He had like 300 and something email communications with this the Wren Collective that is connected to Just Impact, and so you're like, the influence these groups are having on these elected officials, it's extraordinary, to the point where it's like they put out a tweet and then you'll see that tweet repeated multiple times by these prosecutors. So that's kind of how their game is played.
Well, and you've seen me talk on these before, so I reference movies a lot on these things, and I can't remember the title of the movie, but it was a movie with Richard Gere where he was a political consultant. And it is a skill set. I mean, and not everybody can do it. And, generally when you have somebody who's, well, I'm just a line prosecutor. I was, second in charge in the office and the old guy retired and now I'm going to step up and take my position. They don't have the skill set to basically run a political campaign. They need to bring those people in to run those campaigns. And if you have that skill set, you're very valuable. And, I now I've got this job, but hey, if I don't toe the line, they're going to go use that other guy down the road to do the exact same thing to me. I mean, I'm going to get dumped on the side of the road. I mean, I understand the whole getting dumped on the side of the road when you're in your late 50s or early 60s. Like, oh, wait a second, this is my livelihood. What am I going to do? Am I going to go out as a line prosecutor and start representing criminal defendants after I prosecuted them for 40 years? Well, no. So it's almost out of fear that these prosecutors, have towed the line. Now, they are being very selective in who they pick. They're generally picking people that agree with them from the get-go. But, you see people, like Marilyn Mosby, who's no longer in office, and, Kim Gardner, both of whom got nicked for campaign finance violations for money they got, benefits they got from these groups. And then, they're gone. But I know you're talking, the amount of money being levied against the bail bond industry is just scary. Tens, if not hundreds of millions of donor dollars have been spent to run us out of business, but we're still here. I mean, battered to be sure in certain areas, but still here. Ultimately bad ideas don't survive. But keep in mind, I think it was Brennan who announced recently, and my apologies to Brennan if it was another group, but a similar group, that recently stated that their big mistake in pushing bail reform was not working hard enough to outlaw the bail bond industry. And basically the argument was, damn, if these bail bondsmen are still here, they can point out all the fallacies of what we're doing. And no one else has an interest in pointing out those fallacies other than the bail bond industry. So, what does the future hold on this front?
Well, I mean, I think first I'll give you both sides of it, right? I think it's frightening as all hell, right? That's because they're not fighting us based on the merits, right? They're not fighting us based on, okay, you have someone that's accused of a crime, you can't lock him up, You can't release them for, like, how do we all come together to figure out what is the best mechanism to ensure that this guy gets his day in court and that the victim of whatever crime was alleged, that they get their day in court too? How do we bring the balance? I mean, that's why our system's a scale, right? It's the balance of that. How do we figure that out? And what's scary to me is that their whole campaign, their whole effort doesn't seem to focus on that. Their money is buying truth. Their money is creating new facts and then selling the public on those facts as truth. And that to me is frightening. I mean, I even had discussions with family members that I hear spew facts that the bail reform people come out, and it's like, well, how would you just say that? Like, even you have heard this through media channels, through local news, and that to me is scary. But that being said, and I always try to point this out during my presentations, is because I don't want to end presentations and have people jumping off of buildings and doom and gloom, is that I think there is a positive to this though too, is that I always go back to California and Prop 25. We were outspent in a huge way. I mean, don't believe what they're telling you about what was spent. They spent an exorbitant amount of money in this campaign. When our backs were against the wall, we spent a fraction, because we're not these huge Goliaths, these billion-dollar entities that they think we do. They don't understand how bail works. They don't understand the finances of the bail industry. They just see these companies and they look at the penal amount of the bail being written and seeing, because that's the money that people were making. When a bail agent collects a percentage of that, right, and a surety collects even a smaller percentage of that. So the dollars are just blown way out of proportion in terms of our industry and the threat we bring. But the amount of money that they spent versus us, and then for us with facts and messaging and common sense to the voters. And that's what gives me hope, is that you still have voters out there that I think do use common sense. And we were able to beat them when David and Goliath versus us versus them. It's like David was a superhero compared to what we were dealing with. I mean, and yet we beat them. And to me, that gives me hope that people figure it out. And even Prop 36 that just happened in California, people are tired of the crime. They're tired of the lies. They're tired of being told everything's fine when they have to, leave their windows down and leave a bunch of trash in their car so someone thinks that the car was already broken into. I mean, this is what people are resorting to in California because crime is so bad. It's like, well, we're not going to stop the crime, but just make it look like you were already a victim of crime and the bad guy will leave you alone. It's like, that's the solution? So I think people are fed up. I think that we're seeing a return to law and order around the country, slowly but surely. And knock on wood, I'll keep that it keeps going in that direction. So as scary as everything that we see going on around, we talked about with these rogue prosecutors and stuff, I still think that it's gonna pass because I think common sense is gonna prevail, because it takes one murder. I mean, once again, California, 262, another bail reform bill. What happens the week they're voting? A horrific murder in Sacramento, in a community was very close to where a lot of these guys lived in Sacramento. A woman was raped, her dogs and animals were killed, and they were burned to death. And it's like, it was horrific. But this guy is a guy that was a product of the bail reform they were trying to pass. And it got them for 365 days to say, okay, we're off bail reform. And then what happens on January 1st, the next session? Oh, here's another bail reform bill. So, you look for those little moments, but, I still have confidence. I mean, I think we do a really good job. The facts are on our side, but I think these efforts are so well funded, and it's scary what they're capable of.
Well, it's a pseudo-religious, certainly ideological argument, not so much based in fact. I watched Chloe Coburn, a video that she gave a presentation on, and basically was saying there is no crime problem. The crime problem is a politically manufactured problem that the right uses to get elected and put into office. And she had a graph of how, well, look, right before the election, the news media, Fox News covers crime more and more and more and more. And then after the election, it just drops back off and you don't cover crime. And I think if that's your argument, that's going to fly in the face of people's lived experience. And, you can only say, don't believe your lying eyes for so long, before people are like, yeah, no, I don't believe you. And no matter how much money you throw at it.
Yeah. To go down to your movie line, one of my favorite scenes in the movie, it's a Monty Python film where this guy is sitting in an office and a guy comes into his office and on the door it says arguments. And he says, I want to have an argument. And the guy at the desk is, okay. So he sits down and then they bring up some topic and the guy says, and then the guy behind the desk says, no, it isn't. And he goes, yes, it is. And the guy behind the desk goes, no, it isn't. He goes, wait, hold on. He goes, this isn't an argument. This is contradiction. And so it just reminds me of kind of their arguments. Like they don't have any facts. They don't have any real, and it doesn't even like pass the smell test with common sense, yet they just contradict everything you say. So it's like, you feel like you're in this argument that like, you're like, how in the world am I losing this argument when everything is on our side? And then you begin to realize you lose because the money and the influence that the other side is able to create and the reality they're able to create in the minds of consumers through the spending of this money.
And thankfully, most people don't have a whole lot of contact with the criminal justice system. And so they're like, well, I guess these guys know what they're talking about. I've got this postcard that says this, and they've got this chart. It looks pretty visual and it looks pretty professional. And of course, because it is, I guess I'll believe that, so.
Well, you look at even in California, they have this 562 bill right now, the premium refund bill. Okay. If I'm a consumer and I got a legislator out there saying, listen, you get arrested, you go out, you pay for a bail bond, 3 days later, your case gets dismissed, you should get a refund. And it's like, okay, as a consumer, I'm like, hey, that makes sense, right? But that's not giving the argument justice because it's bigger than that, right? It's not just about a refunding a premium, is that person bought a product. They had a choice. I could stay in jail or I can pay to get out. And I'm going to choose to pay to get out, whether it's for 24 hours or whether it's 30 days. And 31st day, they're going to, forget it and dismiss the case. That person had a choice and they signed a contract. And in that contract, it says there's no refund. So it's not just simply as, oh, your case wasn't whatever. It's the bail agent's fault. They should. No, it's a bigger argument than that. But you can see how they can sell something to the consumer as a good idea. And then they put their marketing machine and their money behind it.
And I've actually been thinking about that bill a lot here recently, just because when I was younger, I'm like, well, you ought to, if you don't get convicted, you ought to get a refund of what you had to pay the bond. Now, I wasn't saying a refund from the bondsman. I was saying a refund from the state that charged you. So, I mean, if you want to say, okay, hey, you're entitled to a refund because you had to expend this money because of the actions of the state. Well, who should owe you that refund? Should it be the person who provided the service to you? Or should it be the entity, i.e. the state, that caused you to need that service in the first place? Yeah. But they don't want to do that. That's, that would cost money, to the taxpayers. But if there's someone who's to blame for that, it is the state. If that is a reasonable thing to refund them that money, it shouldn't be coming from the person who provided the service. Well, I came and mowed your grass, but, turns out it rained the next day and you didn't really need your grass mowed until 2 days later. So give me a refund. No.
And when I paid my car insurance premium and I didn't get in an accident, I should get my money back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we Lewis Garrison used that analogy at our last podcast. So everybody should go back and listen to the last podcast too. Well, Eric, I know you've got to cut things short here. Actually, I think we're hitting about an hour anyway, so maybe we didn't cut it all that short, but I know you've got stuff to do. So thank you very much for coming on a second time. And then hopefully we haven't scared you off this time. Maybe, down the road, we'll get to talk again for your next big project. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
No, I really appreciate it. And it's always great talking with you, Shane. Really have a good time.
Thanks, Eric. We would like to thank our guest, Eric Granof, Vice President of Corporate Communications for AIA Surety, for taking the time to talk to us today. While it certainly feels like the worm is beginning to turn on this bail reform issue, a lot of these prosecutors were voted out of office. California passed, Prop 25. This fight against bail reform is not over. People like Chloe Coburn, they're not stupid, and they are true believers, and they're committed, and they're well-funded. And those of us in the bail bond arena cannot take our eye off the ball of following what's going on here. So it's important to get this message out and to see what's going on. And we hope that you'll join us on the next episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we'll continue to bring you critical information and conversations with people involved in the criminal justice system. Thanks a lot.
Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf and executive produced by David Stuckman.